I'm really appreciative of the chance to get up here and talk with you guys today and understand. Throughout the week, I've felt really fortunate to be able to talk to people who are, I guess, outside the geographic basin that I work in and the region I work in, but who are really attempting to do some things that are in a common spirit. It's been a real pleasure to be able to do that. What I'm going to talk to you about today is two things, really. First and foremost, I'm going to tell you about the ranch that I manage, what the goals are there, and some of the work that we've been able to do so far. Then I want to switch gears a little bit and step back and talk about what that can mean, not just to our basin, the Clark Fork watershed, but to, I think, our larger region, and I guess the way that we approach and discuss the really difficult issues that we face as communities, as states, as regions. I'm the Clark Fork Coalition's Ranchlands Program Manager. So that's like a mouthful. But what it means is that I work for a conservation group, the Clark Fork Coalition, that owns a ranch in the upper Clark Fork River, the Dry Cottonwood Creek Ranch. I guess before I get too far into the ranch, I should tell you that tell you a little bit about the way I came to this. I was not born into this. I didn't, inherit a legacy of ranching. In fact, I was born far away from it in Seattle. I kind of had to work my way out towards this, and it's an interesting story. My dad ran the University of Washington's Art Museum for most of his professional life. And one of his best friends there was a rancher and a sculptor named Patrick Zentz. Pat calls himself, he's my godfather. He calls himself my atheist godfather. And he insists to this day on being referred to as God in telephone conversations. So when I was young, my dad and Pat had already had this really close relationship. And I began to work for Pat from an age that would probably really offend people who pay attention to child labor. I worked for Pat for a long time, and I was really fortunate. What he was doing at the time was dryland farming and running cattle near Laurel, Montana. And he was doing that on their family place, but with a bunch of leased land mixed in. So, at the peak, it was a fairly large deal. They were operating 10,000 acres, lots of moving pieces, lots to do. But at the same time, he was doing his sculpture, and his sculpture was really interesting in that it would take and it would translate the intricacies of the landscape, the wind speed, the topography. It would translate those into formats that people could understand. So one concrete example of that is he built a machine that played one of his high tensile fences. It actually plucked it. It was like a huge stand-up bass or something. And so all of a sudden, this invisible force, the wind, the topography, whatever was controlling these machines became immediately accessible to people. Now, that's a long roundabout way of saying that this guy had a very interesting way of thinking about what it meant to be a rancher. And I feel very fortunate to have learned from him in that respect, because he prepared me to think about ranching as, for lack of a better word, something holistic. And I don't use that in the traditional sense. I use that more in the sense of ranching as both a practical, but also an aesthetic and an ethical pursuit. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. So that's kind of how I found my way into it. I was fortunate out of college to get a job working on the Sun Ranch at the south end of the Madison Valley. And then I was fortunate just when I got to grad school to be entrusted with managing the Dry Cottonwood place. So this is the Dry Cottonwood Creek Ranch. This is the headquarters under the little yellow arrow. And I'm not a huge fan of a lot of words on PowerPoint, so mostly you're going to get pictures and I'll explain them. That's the ranch headquarters. What you see in front of you here is the Clark Fork River running through the property. It's in the Deer Lodge Valley, and the Deer Lodge Valley is absolutely a working landscape. It's a working landscape to an extent that very few of the valleys in that part of Montana are anymore. It has not seen the same influx of what I would call recreational ranchers. It has not seen the same level of development pressure that some of the other valleys have seen. It's a place where the majority of the ranches are still multi-generational, pretty small, small to medium-sized operations. And it's also in the second poorest county in Montana, the ranches. So we have some environmental issues, which I'll get into, but we also have some economic issues, which is to say that pretty much everybody you run into out here is, in one way or another, struggling to stay on the land and make their living from it. The geographic context here. This is the headwaters of a 22,000 square mile watershed, the Clark Fork River. Clark Fork River drains into the Snake, drains to the Columbia, eventually to the Pacific. It's one of the farthest west major agricultural valleys in Montana, major cattle valleys in Montana. And the ranch, as I said, sits at the headwaters of this watershed. So the question is, I work for a conservation group. In the past, they did things like work ceaselessly to get a dam removed near Missoula. They brought suit, against, mining companies and everything else. So why are they interested in ranching? Why are they doing this? First and foremost, one of the things you have to understand about this part of the world and most of the montane West is that it's not all productive land. It's little strips of productive land. And those little strips of productive land are by and large owned by ranchers and located around riparian systems, around rivers and creeks and lakes and stuff like that. What they realized is that if they want to achieve some conservation goals in a community, in a system like this, they have to understand the perspective of agriculture. And they have to be able to work seamlessly with the people that own this land and that have the eventual say-so in what happens with it in the long term. Most habitat projects, I would throw this out there, most habitat projects in the West live or die by the way ranchers feel about them. These habitat projects, because most of the productive land is privately owned, even though we have a ton of public land. So, the ranch. This is just a quick little overview. It's not a huge place. It's 2,300 deeded acres. We've got about 1,000 of state lease, and then we have a large, about 30 square mile Forest Service allotment behind it that goes up to the Continental Divide. We've got all this stuff down here by the river, about 900 acres along the Clark Fork River, where we put up hay. We use flood irrigation to hay about 200 acres. We irrigate pasture on probably another 300. And then we've got these pastures that kind of stair-step their way up this bench, ending up here at the forest boundary where our forest permit begins. So that's kind of the layout. And on the allotment, and I'll return to this, we share our allotment with 4 other ranchers. So that's one of the other great things about this is when we deal with how we run cattle, how we maintain stewardship on our allotment, we get to work with 3 of the other largest ranches in the valley. So we can actually, if we can come to agreements with them about how we should treat that land, we may be able to have a broader impact on what happens. This is Butte, this city right here. This is the Berkeley Pit. You guys are probably familiar with Butte and the Berkeley Pit, but if you're not, the richest hill on earth, or used to be before it was a hole. What you're seeing here is actually the tip of the iceberg. This is the open pit mining that went on in Butte. Underground, you would see just a kind of a prairie dog town of tunnels that goes everywhere. They removed a tremendous amount of copper from this area. They took that copper and they moved it to Anaconda, by and large. This is the town of Anaconda, right near where I live. And in Anaconda, they smelted that copper. It's there's probably some of that copper in the, keeping the lights on here right now. It went absolutely everywhere. But what it left us with up there is a contaminated landscape. We have, obviously the Berkeley Pit is one of the nastiest places in the world. If birds die there, they're dead within like 5 to 10 minutes. They had this big issue a while back where something like, like a couple hundred snow geese landed on the pit and just croaked like that. Anaconda, the smelter, spewed out huge amounts of airborne contamination into this landscape. So what we're left with is a landscape that is scattered with contamination. And it comes in two forms. You've got the localized stuff around the smelter, and then you've got the stuff that traveled down the waterways, principally as a result of a flood that happened in 1908. It was like a couple 100-year flood event. It moved a lot of this stuff downstream, and it emplaced it along the river. And that's what we're on the cusp of cleaning up. So this is actually the nation's largest Superfund site. In the coming years, they're going to do a cleanup on about, intensive cleanup on about 40 miles of the river and work along about 140 miles. What you see here is you have a gradient of pollution. Highest pollution is localized right there around Butte Anaconda, and then it tapers off as you go down. We are one of the closest properties to that pollution source, and therefore we have the worst problem of all. But here's another thing you have to understand. This is an aerial picture that I took. This right here, these are known as the Opportunity Waste Repository. It's sort of an ironically named little town. It's just surrounded by toxics and called Opportunity. So you've got this right here, and then what you've got here, this is productive irrigated hayland. So you have these things existing right next to each other. And you have a tremendous challenge coming down the pipe with regards to how do we clean this stuff up right here, and how do we keep using this as productive agriculture. That's a pickle. And that's one of the problems that we're trying to solve on dry cottonwood there. So what I'm putting up here is just really an illustration of the proximity. I've got the slickens highlighted, slickens being these areas of maximum contamination. This is my house right here. This is one of our hay fields. If you look at how close these things are to our most productive lands, you can see that we've got a really delicate situation. We've got, we've got a real challenge. And it also illustrates the fact that the long-term success of this cleanup is going to rest on the shoulders of the people that manage this landscape. Because if you think about it, if they come in, this is all the river bottom that we own, they come in, they dig all this up, they remove it, remove millions of cubic yards of sediment, they fill it back in, they seed it, and then I wouldn't do this, but my neighbor might turn, like 500 pair in on the river the next year, slick that stuff off, and then you're going to have a whole new set of problems related to erosion, weed encroachment, and everything else. So it's delicate, and we really need the buy-in of the people that control this land. Furthermore, you can see this is dry Cottonwood Creek coming in to the Clark Fork right here. I would contend that a river like this, a cleanup like this, lives or dies by the health of its tributaries.